My whole career, even today, is how do I support people in the transition when you are trying to figure out who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? What is the purpose of this all? I look back recently on my career and I'll talk more about what I'm doing now. That is still at the heart of it. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, really helping people at transitional space of becoming of who they really want to be.
In a world where the recruitment of Black educators dominates headlines, one question remains. Where are the conversations with folks who are leaving education? Introducing The Exit Interview, a podcast dedicated to archiving the untold stories of Black folks who have departed from traditional education spaces. I'm Dr. Lyons, and I'm embarking on a mission alongside my esteemed guests. Together, we shed light on the challenges, triumphs, and experiences of Black educators, aiming to inform and empower communities invested in understanding the crucial issue of retention in education. Welcome to The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators. All right, folks, welcome back to The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators. It's me, Dr. Asia, and as always, another fantastic guest. Today, I have Najmah Ahmad. She's here to share her story. We know each other from Catalyst. And shout out to Camila, who's like connecting folks, consultants, Black women, brown women, women of color together in a beautiful space. And so this is another connection. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, shout out to Camila, the connector extraordinaire. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So we've met again out in the sphere, but of course, you're an educator and you're on the East Coast. Is that correct? Did I make that up?
Yep, I'm in DC.
Okay, so you would be like the 45th person from the East Coast. Yeah, I'm glad we're spreading out. More folks from all over are listening to the podcast, are sharing their stories on the podcast. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started. First things first.
Yes.
A lot of people talk about going into education as young folks. Some people join TFA. Some people decide to second career. What made you decide education was for you? What was your story?
Yeah, so education was actually not my initial choice. When I went to college, I was a nursing major. I was a nursing major for 2 years, actually. I knew that I wanted to help people in some way or another. And then I got to my second year in college, and that was the clinicals. And I was like, I actually don't want to be in a hospital all day. And I was like, this is very important to realize at this moment. But then it was like, oh my God, like I'm 2 years in. I went to Xavier University in Ohio. It is not cheap. It is a private Jesuit school. And so it was just like, well, what do I do now? And so I kind of started to look around at the people in my life, right? When we grow up, it's like a handful of careers that we are told that are accessible to us. And so at some point when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pediatrician, wanted to be an astronaut at some point, wanted to be a journalist. I'll come back to journalist later because it has come back around. But, you know, I had an internship at like Procter & Gamble, learning about chemical engineering. It was like the things that were in front of me that people told me. And then nursing, like I said, I always had this inclination to want to care for people, to support people, but I didn't want to be steeped in that. And so when I was looking around, my mentor at the time, when I was at Xavier, was the associate director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And I just started to think about the impact that she had on me, being at a predominantly white institution, being the first in my generation, in my family to go to college. It was really supportive to have someone like her guiding me while I was in my educational experience. And so I was kind of like, oh, I could do that. I want to do that. And so I started to learn more about student affairs, college student affairs, and that was actually a career. I did not know that was a career, to be able to advise, to work in multicultural affairs. And so I ended up switching my major to sociology because I also love to study systems. I also love to study people, the functions, why education systems are the way that they are. I always thought about the fact that, you know, I had access to great education because I lived in predominantly white neighborhoods, but my cousins a mile down the road didn't have access to the same things. I was thinking about that as like a teenager, you know? And so I wanted to study that. And so I switched my major to sociology and then my minor to gender and diversity studies and set forth on understanding what it would take to embark upon a career in higher education. I was not a teacher, but I worked in higher education and administration. And we'll talk more about my path, but I worked in school districts and in the schools as well. But that was my initial foray, kind of wanting to know, how can I still support people in their journeys, not in a hospital, but in a different way. But that higher education, student affairs was kind of my entry point into education.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, on our show, when we talk about educators, we talk about folks who impact youth in any type of capacity, right? The paraprofessionals, school nurses, school psychs. So appreciate that lens that you're offering to our community. So telling us you finished school, where are we working? What are we doing? What is your
Yeah.
experience?
Yeah. So when I first graduated from college, it was 2007. So 2007 going 2008. As we know, that was a huge economic crisis in our country. And
Yeah.
so I graduated and I didn't have a job yet. Luckily, I had a grandfather who was like, don't come back home. And he got me an apartment and he was like, I'm going to give you some months to figure it out. And so I stayed in Cincinnati where I went to school.
Wait, shout
And
out to
so,
grandpa. Let's just hold on.
that man,
So what was home for you?
like 45 minutes away in Middletown, Ohio. That's where I went to high
Yeah.
school. And so he was like, mm-mm. He was really the only reason. I always love to talk about the ancestors and everything I'm doing, but he was the one who made sure that I even got to go to college. Like so many of us, most of my family couldn't co-sign for loans. Nobody was paying for it. Nobody had the credit, but he was the only one. And so shout out to the loans, I guess. But he was the one who helped me and to put me through. And so, yeah, he was like, don't come back here. And so he got me an apartment in Cincinnati. And so I started working for a nonprofit. And so I was working with at-risk youth in the community and going into the high schools and doing workshops for them around leadership. Actually, now I think about it, around trauma, around really understanding how their trauma impacts them in their education. It was with the Alcoholism Council of Cincinnati, actually. And so I would do workshops in the schools with at-risk, quote unquote, at-risk youth at that time. And so from there, then I went to work with the Cincinnati Youth Collaborative. And so I was working again in high schools. Essentially, I was a counselor in the high school or a supplemental counselor. And I would work with the seniors to help them on high school planning and to understand, how do you fill out the FAFSA, all the things I struggle with,
Sure, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Nobody helped me with. I was in there like, nobody gonna help me. Okay, let me figure this out. And so,
and grandpa wasn't, that FAFSA wasn't his lane.
nah,
I
he was
write
like,
the
take
check,
my
I signed the loan. Yes,
He's like, here's my social and my date of birth.
exactly.
Figure it out, right?
Be well, yes.
And I was in youth groups too, though. I was in Upward Bound and things like that. And so I'm grateful for that support. So essentially, I was paying that forward. I was being that person that I had and that I wish that I had. It was really interesting, though, because at that time, I was like 22. A lot of the kids looked older than me. And so thought that I was like a high school student, right? And so it was kind of like that. How do I assert myself as an adult? But it was great because I could relate to them as well, not being so, far removed from them. I was in the high schools. I was working with high school seniors who were like 18, 19 years old. And I'm like 22, helping them to understand their journey. And so I did that for a while, but I didn't have my master's yet. I was coming out of undergrad and I was just like, I'm tired. But I knew, to work in higher ed, which was my ultimate goal in college student affairs, you need to have a master's.
Yeah.
But I wasn't ready yet. Personal things that I had going on in my life and wanting to just get out of Ohio, wanting to leave. And so I actually ended up moving to Miami and I worked at Miami-Dade College. And that was my first role in student affairs. And I worked in admissions, actually. And so at a community college, but it's the largest community college in the nation.
Oh, wow.
I think they have like 6 or 7 campuses or something.
Oh, wow.
And
yeah.
hundreds of thousands of students down in South Florida. So it was a community college, but it had the feel of a much larger kind of institution. And so I was working in student life and admissions down there, kind of getting a feel for how to navigate a campus. What does that look like? I was working with a lot of first generation college students, a lot of migrant students, immigrant students as well. And so those kind of complexities on how to support those young people who are looking to fund their education, right? Again, going back to my own struggles. My career often has been, how can I be what I needed for other people?
Yeah, we hear that a lot on the podcast, right? It's that reciprocity piece.
Yeah,
It's that like, who could have really supported me, or exactly that beacon, that person. If they had a person, then they want to be like that person. If they had no one, then they want to be that for someone else.
absolutely. So yeah, and then stayed in Miami and I was like, I do not like it here. I did not want to be in Miami. I always wanted to be, I'm a huge history nerd, politics in the back of my head. I was going to run for president one day, be a
Yeah.
university president, all these things. And so DC had always been calling to me. And it was around the time where Obama had been elected. And so it was like, I want to be there. I want to meet Michelle. I want to go. I got to go. And
Yes.
so ended up moving to DC and I was working at Trinity Washington University here in DC. And it is a private Catholic university. It started out as an all girls school. For the most part, it still is. Nancy Pelosi went there, a few other kind of prominent political figures. But at some point, it changed to be predominantly Black. And so a lot of the girls at Trinity were from DC, first generation college students. A lot of them came from tough circumstances. A lot of them had different mental health issues going on. Quite a few of them didn't have stable home lives. And so Trinity, if you look it up, kind of prides itself as being a place of opportunity for young women who may not be able to go to other universities, but still provide them with a great education. And so that was an experience. I worked in residence life. If any of you that are listening work in higher ed, you know that res life is like, you are a therapist, you are a programmer, you are an auntie, a mentor, you are, I was going to the hospital with students who were suicidal.
Yeah.
I was, helping them to navigate all kinds of circumstances. And so it was like I was on call, 24 hours a day, some weeks at a time. And so just always on, but really being steeped within the university and the culture and the student life. And so I actually worked there and I started my master's program. And so my master's program, it was a distance learning program. So I would go for a residency for a month and then come back up. It was down in Florida at Nova Southeastern. They had a really great higher ed program. While I was in that program, I had a practicum. And so I created an alternative spring break program for the university, just things that I
Mm.
felt that these girls really deserve, but because of where they came from, I think that people thought that they were not capable of
Sure.
achieving. And that really was tough for me when I was working in that space. Like, why are we not challenging these young women? Why are we not giving them these opportunities? Because they've never had them before. You just assume that they can't learn and be immersed in them. So I created an alternative spring break program. We actually went to Selma, Alabama, and I created like a leadership curriculum for them to understand. It's so funny talking about this. And I'm like, man, my work has really been the same. But understand the ancestors and what they did in order for them to be where they are. What does servant leadership look like? What does that really mean to be a servant leader? What are you here for? Right? Beyond getting your degree, who do you want to be? What do you want to contribute back to society and to humanity? And so I'm so proud of that program. It's actually still going today. And so I started that, it was like 15 years ago now.
I want to pause you for a second because as you're talking, I'm thinking like how awesome it is that one, the master's program that you're in had this opportunity for you to freedom dream in this way, right?
Hmm.
And then for the university that you worked in to say like, sure, put that together.
Yeah.
I can't imagine how the young women felt like hearing about this and being able to do this and how you were, I'm sure, both nervous and excited to give this opportunity to them. And and I cut you off right as you said this, that was 15 years ago and it's still there. That has to be something that makes you so proud to know that it's going on without you, because we know that so many programs or initiatives that folks start, once they leave, it dissolves either the next year or the year after. So like hats off for you for creating that, and to the university for still continuing to fund that and seeing the value of the work that you've done.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. Yeah. And looking back, so this was 15 years ago. I was 24 years old. I was just like, I want to do this. And it's like getting permission for me to fly. I think it might have been like 10 young women down to Alabama to stay overnight. We were down there building houses, but then we participated in, they do every year, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And we talked to Reverend Shuttlesworth down there who marched with Dr. King.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of my favorite experiences of my career. I think about it often. I have young women who went on that trip who I'm still connected with, who reach out to me from time to time, and they talk about it like, oh my God, that was like so transformative for them. Like you said, I am appreciative to the university to allow me to do it. I actually partnered with campus ministry, the dean for student life, who's still there, Dean Michi, which is probably why the program is still going. But she was definitely an advocate for that program, that these young women deserved an experience like this. Like they had never even heard of alternative spring break before. But coming from Xavier, where I went, private Jesuit school, their motto was being men and women for others. And that's why I went to Xavier, because service has always been a part of my life, and giving back and understanding that we're a part of a global and a greater community beyond ourselves. So yeah, that experience. But then on the flip side, the frustration started to build because I saw the lack of resources that those young ladies got. And I saw the lack of resources that I had to fight tooth and nail for. As much as I was happy that they did this alternative spring break, it was a battle. There were some things, the dorms having mice and just crazy substandard conditions in a lot of ways, or talking to seniors who were needing help with the senior project, and they were reading a book, The Giver. I don't know if you've ever read The Giver before. Yeah, it's one of my favorite books from when I was like in the third grade, I think.
Yeah, it's like we're teaching it in sixth grade when I was teaching.
Yeah, and so I love it. I love the book. I love what it stood for. But they were reading it as seniors in college. And I was like, and there was a struggle to it, like to understanding it. And so it just started to make me think about, how are we preparing young people before they get to college? I understood, how much I was prepared, but how much I still didn't know. And so it made me want to experience something different, a different kind of university. I had worked at a community college, and I worked at Trinity, which was a small private school. And so in every role that I had taken, I was usually the first person in that position. They had usually just created that role. And I was like, okay, I'll go do that. And actually, I love it. It actually speaks to my entrepreneurial spirit, now that I think about it too. Like, I love to start new things.
Sure.
And not be burdened by what has been. Like, well, we've always done it this way. I've been in a new role, so nobody could tell me how it's always been, because nobody has ever done it before. So I always loved that. And so I actually next went to go work for New York University, and they were building a site here in DC, part of their global campus. So they had 12 campuses or something around the world. And so the NYU students would come down to DC, and they would be, interning at the Supreme Court, at the Capitol, like at these really prestigious institutions. And so I worked in student life there, literally was putting together the policies and procedures as the walls were being built around us in the building that we were staying here. That was an interesting experience. It really did make me see the dichotomy between what we say is possible for young people. That was predominantly affluent students who were coming down, who were, like I said, interning on the Hill and things like that. But they still were struggling mentally. A lot of mental health crises and issues. And it started to weigh on me to the point I was, and this is trigger warning for anyone who's listening to this, But I used to have to do, if the student was suspected to be experiencing mental health crisis, I would have to go check on them and like check their rooms and stuff. And you never know what is going to happen when you knock on that door, when you open that door. And this was around the time of Sandy Hook that had happened. I had a young man who was from that town, and it was just overwhelming for him. And so I ended up having to escort him to the hospital and help him to get some services and things like that. I was there, I remember, until the next morning at like 8 o'clock in the morning, come back to campus and had to do a debrief with the team. He's okay, but physically, but I'm talking to the team and they're like crying and I'm just sitting there and I'm like, why are y'all crying? And then inside I was like, oh, this was a traumatic experience
Uh-huh.
and I am numb. This isn't okay. I can't do this anymore. Like I've become too numb to
Yeah.
this. This is not okay for me. And so that was when I think, decided that I wanted to get out of higher ed.
So this is really
Yes, please.
interesting because I think that I'm curious as the folks are listening to this episode, how many people in the K-12 space imagine higher education to be different, to be more glamorous, more glorious,
Oof.
more, right?
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
And I've worked in both spaces.
Yeah,
But yeah.
you did. And right. And so people in higher ed saying, well, you all teach third grade. Or and that grass is greener kind of feel.
Yes.
And I love that you had to check in and say like, okay, I'm becoming a shell of my former self. I remember when I was in my doctoral program, there was a woman named Laura in there who was in charge of Res Life for CU Boulder, or I don't know if she was in charge, but she was in the department.
Yeah.
And she was on call every once in a while during class. And she had a situation where someone had committed suicide and she was called from class to the situation. And, weeks later when we saw her again in class, we kind of discussed the emotion of it, right? And it never occurred to me. I struggled in school with lots of things, but not mental health in that way. It was like, sure, the sun wasn't out in Michigan. It was cloudy. But this, to me, felt very temporary. And so just want to say hats off to you, Res Life folks who do and did that work, because these aren't just adults. These are still people's children. These are still family members and community members, and you are there and have to be there to to hold space, right? And they're navigating these really hard parts of their life. So I just want to say hats off to you and Res Life folks for that.
Thank you. Yes. Much love to any residence life, student life folks who are listening, especially right now. I couldn't imagine we talk about young people not being okay, and the older people aren't okay either. And so being in that space is a dedication of love. And so, yes, sending all of the energy to anyone working in education, period, right now, but especially those working in those spaces. But it caused me to want to take a step back and think about, how are we even preparing young people before they get here? Because on both ends of the spectrum, on either ends of the spectrum, I was experiencing young people who were woefully unprepared mentally, physically, emotionally, to go from being at home or whatever situation they were in before they came to college to now being like, okay, well, you're an adult now, figure it out. And it's like, wait a minute, like we're missing something, right? We're missing something, even from the most affluent to young women who were in foster care, who were wards of the state. Emotionally, they were not okay. They were not ready. Experientially, they were not ready. They had not experienced what we were calling them to now be. And so I wanted to take a step back. I actually left higher ed, put my phone on silent. I have not taken my phone off silent since then, because I was just like, oh my God, I don't have to be on call anymore. It does something to your nervous system to never be able to rest, right? And that's something else that I think about in my career. And I'll talk more about the healing. This was all playing a toll on me as well, as someone who at that time was a perfectionist and wanted to save the world. I'm just like chasing this thread of, okay, I worked with this group, I did the nonprofit, and then I went to higher ed with the first generation college students, and I couldn't do enough there. So then I went to NYU to try to see if I could work with this group. but that wasn't working. So, okay, now let's go to nonprofit. And so I worked with an organization here in DC, and they have a branch in Chicago and Baltimore called Urban Alliance. And they worked with young people who were preparing to transition from high school and to go on to their next steps, but they worked with them on the preparation piece. And so I was actually the director of curriculum outreach. And so I would go into the schools, into the high schools, and I helped them to develop a curriculum basically to prepare young people for the future, what to expect from job searching to how do you show up in these spaces? What does professionalism look like? How do you carry yourself? How do you navigate these worlds? Like I said, I wasn't a teacher, but I was in the schools often delivering
We
this
would say that
curriculum.
that was teaching,
Yes,
right? And
yes.
that's all what you're talking about. And obviously you have more to your story, but it's very full circle, right? It's like very much older kids, older youth,
Yeah.
college students, preparing them, again, standing in that gap, holding space.
The transition. I
Yeah.
feel
Oh,
like,
yes.
my whole career, even today, is how do I support people in the transition when you are trying to figure out who am I? Why am I here? What am I doing? What is the purpose of this all? I look back recently on my career and I'll talk more about what I'm doing now. That is still at the heart of it. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, really helping people at transitional space of becoming, of who they really want to be. And so I did that for a few years. And every role I've been in, I've been promoted every year, right? Because I'm like, I'm going to be the best. I'm going to figure this
Yeah.
out. Like this achievement addiction that I had. It was like, I got to keep going. I got to figure this out. I got to fix education, right?
Let me pause. Achievement addiction.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that folks heard that, because there's a lot of people, especially in education, who have achievement addiction. I love that you said that. I just wanted to pause you. Go ahead.
And that's what I'm trying to do in this conversation so you all can see what I was doing, but I want you to know how I was feeling as well and why I had to get out. We'll talk more about that. But it was, especially as a Black woman, I was always told that we had to work twice as hard to get half as much. And so understanding now what that actually did to me and my nervous system was that I was going to have to be a superwoman so that I could get recognized, so that I could get, all these accolades, but I also wasn't going to be compensated fairly.
Of course not.
Right?
Of course
But
not.
I was told that that was normal. So I'm working at a nonprofit. I'm a director, right? I have a master's degree at that point. I'm living in Washington, D.C. I'm traveling between all of these regions. I'm writing curriculum, this program, multi-million-dollar, nonprofit and program. And I was making like $48,000 in Washington, D.C., right? Trying to afford an apartment. And so I'm like, I'm stressed out there because I'm hungry. And I'm like,
Quite literally.
I'm hungry and I'm
Yeah.
tired. And so all of things, but I'm still trying to support these young people. And so then Baltimore, was one of our sites. And so I would go to the schools in Baltimore. And so this was around the time, the Baltimore uprisings. I don't know if you remember with after Freddie Gray. And so me being me, I've always been a baby radical to the organization. I'm like, we need to say something. Some of our schools that we would work with, Douglas High School was a school that was on the news where the police were, and they was like smoke canisters and tear gas and all this stuff. And we're sitting there watching, like, I know these young people. I'm in DC, but I know these young people. But the organization didn't want to speak out. They thought that it wasn't in their best interest. And that really did something to me. It was really disappointing to me to be in a space where an organization purports to be for students, but does not feel comfortable in speaking for students. And so I then decided that I was going to create my own curriculum and in my own free time, partner with another organization. And I went up to Baltimore and I created a curriculum for the young people on how to channel, alchemize. I know the word alchemize now, but alchemize their pain and their frustration into power and into leadership. Like, how do you take everything that you're feeling and move this past being this moment? Feel it though, and understand what you're feeling, and now take it into leadership and into power. And so I did a workshop with them, and that was another highlight of my career. Is those young people were phenomenal, and just the righteous anger that they had, and
Sure.
acknowledging that with them. But that was another pivotal moment in my career where I was disappointed, but I also started to see the system for what it was, and that the system was more concerned with peace instead of justice, right?
Yeah.
That was another benchmark for me.
So this is interesting because, we talk about on the show that folks who are kind of disenfranchised with traditional education spaces should consider nonprofit work if they're not fully prepared to be an entrepreneur or they still want to be close to youth. And this, I'm glad you're talking about this because this is something that happens as well, right? Where we look at the website of the nonprofit, we get so inspired by executive director or whoever we're speaking with in the hiring phases of it, then we get there, right? And it's not quite exactly as liberatory as we thought it would be. And so there's so many folks who come onto the podcast who had a stint in nonprofit, myself included, where for me, leaving K-12 and saying, I can't be in education in that way anymore, but let me try nonprofit work, and just totally being disenfranchised from it because you said that this is going to be a place of liberation for youth and for the folks who work there, because a lot of us are coming from other places where our ideas were silenced, our mental health was not well, and some of us should have took a pause and done some therapy.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Absolutely. We
Yeah.
get to a place and they're like, yeah, this is great. You're awesome. And then we get into this same kind of cycle, right? Which is why I think so many people are so over nonprofits. And that's too bad because there are some that are doing really great work, but there's so many that aren't or aren't fully showing up in the way that they could, that it makes people bitter towards the nonprofit work.
Absolutely. And then because I really want the listeners to think about this systemically. So when we think about who funds nonprofits, we think about philanthropy, we think
Yes.
about the problems of philanthropy, that they want control over communities. They don't want to necessarily solve the problems, but we want to maintain the status quo oftentimes. And so that doesn't look like liberation all the time.
Yeah,
And
most
then
times it doesn't.
most of the times it does not, right? Like looking at the kafia behind you, it does not look like that. It is just here. We just gonna keep people contained and, but still offer some good, right? We did some great work, and that was so frustrating because you can see it. You're like, but if we just tell the truth, we could actually do some great work here.
Yeah.
But it's that fear of the truth. And then we think about, too, when you talk about the mental health aspect, oftentimes, and I'm not just talking about the nonprofits I worked at, but I see it all the time. Instead of paying people what they're worth, you give them a happy hour, right? Staff happy hour. Everybody drink. What are we doing here, right? It's like we used to have so many
Oh,
staff happy
yeah.
hours. So many staff happy
The
hours. And
happy
it's like
hours.
open bar, drink. So
Yeah.
you're not feeling it. You're
Yeah.
numb.
Or the swag. The
Yeah.
happy hour, the
You too.
swag, some random gift card that was purchased with points from buying things for the organization. Yeah, you make some great points.
Yeah. So did that. And then I was like, okay, this isn't enough, right? And I wanted to impact more young people because that was cool that we had this program, but I'm like, I want to get at the system of it all. So that's when I went to go work for DC Public Schools. I worked in central office. I was on the college and career readiness team. So DC is interesting because it's not a state, but it operates like a state. So it's the LEA, the local education agency, kind of operated like a state education agency as well. Like I see the Office of the State Superintendent, but we kind of were very much autonomous in that way. And so again, came into a position that was brand new on the team because there had been so much focus on college that every student's going to go to college. But if you look at the data, realistically, only about 35% of the young people were going to college. So it's like, what are we telling the other 65%? Good luck. Like you on your own. I don't know. So I was kind of brought in to fix that and to figure out, okay, how do we actually prepare all young people for the future? But I was basically an alien. Like I came in and I was like, One of the things I used to say is that every career is the goal for everyone, because how it was being spoken about at that time was college, and then those who are not capable of college, then that's the other side. And it's like, hold on, no, no, no. Career preparation, life preparation is for every person. The goal is not to go to college and stop. Like, there's something that comes after that. And so we need to be preparing all young people, and then also understanding that if you expose young people to careers in life, they'll make better decisions if they are going to college. So they're not going to major in nursing for 2 years and then get into a hospital and be like, oh, wait, I don't like this. I could have done that in high school, right? Like, I
Yeah,
could have,
exactly.
And so my work was centered around that. How do we prepare all young people for the future, all menu of options, and let them decide? But beyond just career, because I never wanted to just create another just workers, right? But again, at the transition, who do you want to be? What do you want to contribute back to society? What do you want to experience? What do you want your life to feel like, to look like, to be? And so worked with the city. I created a citywide internship program. I created a curriculum called Tenacity. If you're listening and you need a life skills, career readiness curriculum, it's open source. It also still exists. So Tenacity curriculum, DCPS, you can Google it. It'll come up. It's free. I think it's like 150 pages. So always recommending that to folks. But created a paid internship program when I came on board to DCPS. I think it was like, I call it, they were doing random acts of career readiness, but helping them to actually put some strategy and structure around it. So that by the time I left, there were over 1,000 young people in paid internships with the city.
Oh, wow.
We had over, 250 employer partners, built out employer industry advisory boards who are also contributing back to the curriculum. I love that work, but it left me, it was hard. I really had to recover from that position. There was a lot of politics. It was a lot of seeing behind the scenes, working at the district level, how DC operates. The mayor is very much involved with the school. So a lot of it was the appearance of achievement and not actually celebrating the actual achievement. And so there were points when they were saying, 100% of young people graduated from X, Y, and Z school. And I saw it on the news and I'm like, no, they didn't. I was just in there talking to 5 of them who didn't graduate. So, and then that blew up eventually because some reporters started digging. And it was so frustrating to me because, again, but if they would have just told the truth, there was so much to celebrate about how far we came. But it was just that insistence of the appearance of doing the work, that of just doing the work, right? And navigating, quote unquote microaggressions, which we know to be racism. I was that person who wanted to push, but people wanting to track certain students into certain pathways or saying what certain students from certain schools and certain neighborhoods were capable of and what others weren't, and constantly having to fight back on those narratives, and then leaving meetings and people, I'm so glad you said that. I'm so glad like, yo, you could have backed me up.
Like, in the meeting, in real time, sweetie.
In real time.
Yes.
Y'all got me just out here on this limb. But
which is so common. That piece of speaking up, being the only person, and then, of course, all of the heat comes back towards you, right? That happens so much. And we hear that a ton on the podcast.
It was overwhelming, working in a space where some leadership had been sued multiple times for how they treated staff of color, and everybody knows it, but it's just allowed to persist over and over and over again. Eventually, I left there, again, wanting to keep achieving, still not healing, still not pausing, still just kind of shoving it all down because I was in pursuit of something. I was in pursuit of me fixing the education system so that I can say I did it. I achieved this thing, right? And so I went to the national level. And so I was working for an organization, the Council of Chief State School Officers. I'm just putting everybody's name out right now.
It is what it is.
It is what it is, right?
You're right. This you won't be on the podcast.
This is freedom. This is freedom.
Yes, this is freedom. I love that.
Freedom. This is freedom. So I was working for the Council of Chief State School Officers. And again, I was one of the first Black women in leadership. Let me tell you this. So I started at this job And it's like the first week. So probably like the second day, a Black man comes into my office and he's like, I want to give you the plantation orientation. And I was like, what did I just get myself into? Like, what? And I had someone else come in my office and they told me, like, just be careful. We can't really congregate like that in big groups as Black people because they'll think we're like, I was like, what? Like, this is my first week of being there. And I was, like I said, one of the first Black women directors. They only had a few. And I was leading a webinar. And after the webinar, I got a message from a Black woman who was on the webinar. She didn't work there, an outside partner. And she was just like, I'm so happy to see you there. She was like, I've never seen a Black woman leading anything at this. And I'm like, all right. What did I just sign up for? Right. My role was to inform national career readiness policy across all states and to work with leadership and everything. And so I was really excited. This was like my dream role. I was literally working next door to the Capitol in DC. I'm like, mama, I made it, right?
Yeah, sure.
And making more money than anybody in my family had ever made before. And I'm like, okay, all right, I'm here. And it was quickly encapsulate this. It was more of the same, getting into that position and realizing it was a bit of a disillusionment. Like, oh, the system is broken. Or it's not broken. The system is operating just as it was designed, right?
I mean, at this point, you've seen it at all levels.
All levels, because I'm trying to find, I'm like, we can do it. We can fix it. Come on, y'all. I see it. Because I could see it. I'm like, if we just tell the truth, we can fix it. Like, if we just tell the truth. And so in this role, that was, and I tell this story actually on my podcast in my first episode, but I remember early on in that position, I was leaving work one day. It was like 8:00 at night and I'm exhausted. I probably had worked like a 12, 13-hour day fighting about policy and how we show up and navigating all these microaggressions. I had been we were actually in a leadership retreat and we're learning about DEI and everything. In this retreat, we were like in a break and I had my locks like pinned up and this white colleague tries to touch my hair. She's like, I love your hair. And I like have to do like a matrix spin out of it. And I'm like, don't ever do that again. And so all of these things, and I'm just like, this was it. This was my pinnacle. Like, I don't even know where to go after this. I've done every single level.
Yeah.
And so I'm leaving work and I'm walking down the street. I'm not a very emotional person at that time outwardly. Literally tears just start streaming down my face and I can't stop it. And I'm like, oh my God, what has happened? It's like a Tuesday afternoon and I'm crying, walking to the train to go home. And this voice in my head was like, I don't want to be here anymore. And it scared me. And I talk about this in the episode. I'm like, because immediately I didn't know if I meant I didn't want to be at that job anymore or I didn't want to be here anymore.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I got to get some help. I can't carry this anymore. So that was the moment when I decided to go to therapy and to find a therapist, because there was this disillusionment that I had dedicated, more than a decade to this career. And I got to this point where I'm just like, for what? Like, clearly, this is not something that I can fix myself, right? And so then it goes to my own stuff. And so that's when I started therapy. And it was so many other things that played into that. But I remember kind of fast forwarding a little bit with my therapist, talking to her probably maybe about a year or so in, and I was still at that job at that point. And she had said to me, Najmah, you're going to have to work for yourself. And I'm like, no, I want to change the system from the inside. Like, no, And she was like, how long has the organization been around? And I think at that point, maybe they were going on nearing like 100 years. And she was like,
at this point,
if you don't think if they wanted to fix education, they wouldn't have done it by now. And I was like, oh, yeah.
Shout out to your therapist and every therapist around the world telling hard truths to folks.
Man, because I was like, I'm gonna have to go work for myself.
Yeah.
I would have to go work for myself. And in that time, we had a pandemic, but even before the pandemic, so 2020, we had this racial reckoning of sorts, right? With George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and a number of police killings that had been made, kind of nationwide outrage. And so in that moment, the organization, they ordered, white fragility for everyone. They ordered Between the World and Me for everyone. I don't think anybody ever read them, but they
Probably
ordered them
not.
for the whole team, right?
Yeah.
I think Pedagogy of the Oppressed maybe was another one that they ordered for everybody. We're about to do anti-racism action planning, or we're going to do all these things. And I'm like, okay, bet, let's go. This is what I've been waiting for. And so I'm getting ready. I'm working with a group of states to help them with their policy. And I'm talking like, okay, this is what anti-racism is, and this is how you incorporate it into your work, and da 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 da. And then we got to the point where critical race theory became the boogeyman. And the organization was like, actually, don't say Black anymore. Don't even, because the Southern states don't like it and it makes them uncomfy. And so, it's really about the states' rights to independence. And I was like, states' rights? That sounds like slavery. So
Yeah, for real.
I'm now in this space being me. If you've heard everything about my career, that's not going to work for me to censor me and to tell me what I can and can't say if I'm telling, the truth, because we can't solve policy if we're not looking at who is the furthest away, right? Who's the closest to the pain? That's where we have to target these resources. And that's what it's called targeted universalism. That was the model that I was and still operate under. It's like, yes, we can have universal goals, but you can't achieve a universal goal by funneling all the resources to those who are the closest to the goal.
Yeah.
Because then you just widen the gap.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't make common sense, right? And so, but it was like when I'm saying, okay, we need to funnel these resources to Black and brown kids, immigrant youth, those, everything. It was like, well, you can't really say that. And so that was the point where I'm like, nope, I'm done with this. Like and
Your
then
therapist
we had
in the background the whole time.
She was just like, just sipping, just waiting.
Was patiently waiting. Yes.
Right. But the fear is still there, right?
Sure,
it's
of
like,
course.
but what does that mean? Where am I going to go? Like, I've got this check, this 9 to 5. But then the pandemic came and it flipped my world, as everyone else's world, upside down. I was working from home at that time, but I had so much stress that was going on from this job that at some point my back went out. I developed sciatica and I had never had back problems in my life. I was like 34 at that time or something, 35, I don't know. And I was healing though. I was in therapy. And so I'm able to start to understand how stress impacts our nervous system, impacts our physical health, and how it starts to show up in our body. And I wasn't treating my body well, right? Because stress, you're not working out, you're not moving, you're not eating right. It's like, I'm gonna eat what I can when I can't, right?
Just hurry up, shovel it in, just go.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, there was no mindfulness. I wasn't doing none of that. That was
slow
like,
chewing.
yeah, right. No, exactly. Exactly. All of this, it was like a business trip or something I was supposed to go on. I had no desire to go. It was with people who the CEO, I had a mark on me. I had a mark on my back because I was pushing people to tell the truth. And so I was the problematic one now. I don't know if y'all heard this article from Pet to Threat. So I came in, everybody was excited. I'm dope. Oh, Najmah. And then I started talking and they're like, actually, shut up, little Black girl. Like nobody asked you to hold us accountable for what we said we were going to do, right?
Let me pause you for a second because you've said a lot in this little amount of time. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is the sciatica. Even going back to your story, like, I don't want to be here anymore. And it all speaks to something that we talk about all the time on the podcast with racial battle fatigue, right? The fatigue of experiencing racial stress, racism related stress day in and day out. And it shows up in these ways. And you said you had a therapist too, right? And so it shows up in these ways in our physical, our body, emotional, behavioral, psychological, all these ways where for some of us, we realize it's happening and we can equate it. And some people tell themselves, like, I can handle it. This has nothing to do with the racism at my job. This is just fill in the blank or when I come back from vacation, it'll be all over with, and not really being able to accept for lots of reasons. Like, no, actually, the racism I'm experiencing in my workplace, beyond and also out there in the world, but in the workplace, because we're there the most, is impacting my health. And so I just wanted to say, I always want to pause when people talk about that and just say, like, racial battle fatigue, for those in our audience who've never heard of it, is the amount of time we lose coping with racial stress and trauma, right? And it costs us hospital bills. It costs us time with our family. It costs us so much. And we need to be in spaces, and you're getting to this, I'm sure, where we're not experiencing racial battle fatigue as much, because how do we avoid racism in America as Black folks? How do we dampen that down and so that we can heal? Yeah.
Absolutely. I tell people, for me and for everyone, it has to hurt enough first.
Ooh-wee.
But your threshold for pain, I had a high tolerance for pain. I had a high tolerance for pain until I literally couldn't walk. This work is very spiritual for me as well. All of these synchronicities popped up. I saw this poem, I want to say by Alice Walker. Oh, I have to find it. But it was basically talking about the pain that we carry, that you're talking about. And at the end of the poem, it was talking about it's breaking your back. And I'm literally laying there, can't walk. In this poem, it popped up on my Instagram or something, right? In the universe, right? And I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, it is breaking my back. I'm trying to carry all of this and I have to put it down. I have to put it down and I have to focus on, why am I here? Why am I here? Beyond my achievements, beyond trying to fix this system that is not possible to fix. I'm sorry, y'all. It is not, because it's doing what it was designed to do. System cannot fix itself. Even with the best of intentions, once you're inside of it, you're a part of it. And you can work to disrupt it, but eventually it will spit you out because you are now a foreign object.
Yeah.
To this system, right? You're cancerous to the system. So it's going to expel you in one way or another. It just is. I'm sorry. But you can do some good while you're there. You can, but you have to be aware of, what is it doing to you in return? And start to take notice and learning how to take care of yourself outside of these systems. And then having your exit strategy, right?
Yeah.
Having that exit strategy. And so, yeah. So I went on medical leave for my back. And long story short, they basically were like, don't come back. They were like, actually, we can't find any funding. They told me that career readiness was no longer a priority for the country at a time where we're facing economic recovery from a pandemic. Anybody is talking about is how we're preparing young people for the future. So I was like, oh, I see. So it's actually no longer my choice. God, the universe, the ancestors were like, girl, get out. Get out.
Yeah.
It was actually a blessing because I was on medical leave. We had good benefits. That was one thing. My medical leave covered me for a month or so. And then they're like, we'll put you on administrative leave after that, paid administrative leave. They shut down my email before I even was gone, right? It was interesting. I spent that time, though, maybe 2.5, 3 months, building my business. And so I created the Chisholm Group, named after Shirley Chisholm, my shero. I was an economic justice and education consulting firm, because I knew that career readiness was still a priority for the country. But then it was like, but I can do it in my own way, because a lot of the people that I worked with, they loved the work that I was doing and how I was supporting them and telling the truth and really supporting young people. So actually, a lot of my clients that I worked with, that organization, they followed me over and I started subcontracting. And so at the end of 21, going into 2022, this is actually my third year. Well, I just completed my third year of working for myself full time.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes. That was my journey through education up until starting and going out on my own in 2022.
That's a story, right?
Yeah, it was a lot.
Said, yeah, you all the high school, and you were in colleges, smaller colleges, larger one, and the federal, nonprofit, all these ways that you were able to, as much as you could, support young people, right? So I'm going to ask you, We know what the straw was. And I'm loving that you talk about this. Like, folks, the decision comes up. The exit's going to tell you either you're going to get shoved off the exit. It's coming up for a lot of people, unless you want to turn your head or turn an eye away from harm. Like, folks who are like 50 years, and I've been 50 years in the same space. Like,
Jesus.
you've closed your eyes to a lot of harm to young people and to yourself and to your colleagues for whatever reason that has happened. I think I want to ask you two questions. The first one is there a Black educator that you would like to shout out?
I would shout out my mentor that I talked about who made me want to go into higher ed in the first place. So Takia Howard, at that time, she's Takia Oster, but she has been my mentor since then. I still am connected to her. She's also my soror. I'm a Delta. And so she really taught me what it meant to be confident in myself, to be a leader, to use my voice, to stand up for things. She really encouraged my leadership in that way. I was basically modeling myself after her, modeling my career. Like, she was fly. Everybody was just like, oh, Takia is dope. Like, you can go talk to her about anything. And so I always wanted to be that person who could provide that feeling for people, that you could come to them without judgment. There were times she would just look at me and be like, what's wrong? And one time she predicted something that was going on with me that I'm like, how the hell did you do that?
Yeah.
And she was just there though. Like, even on the weekends, like when our friend group, somebody was, going through a crisis, she showed up on the weekend. She wasn't working. She was working in multicultural affairs. She didn't need to be there, but she was. And like I said, over the years, she's just been a mentor to me when I'm applying for jobs. Like, she was always like, let me put her down as my recommendation, my reference, just talking to her about my career, things that I was experiencing along the way. So, and she still works in higher ed now, different university, but she has made a career out of molding and supporting young Black youth in particular, but minority students as well, to really lean into our brilliance and to lean into our power. So yeah, I would shout out to Takia for sure.
Shout out to her. Thank you. And our
Yes.
last question is for you. And this is, I can see the theme, and I'm sure you've reflected on this. You talk about this in your podcast, like you said. For you, what does it mean to be well?
So the first thing that comes to mind when you ask me that question, there's this book called The Salt Eaters. And in the book, a quote that is in there, I'm paraphrasing a bit, is, you say you want to be well. Are you sure, my dear? To be well is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. We talk about healing and wanting to be healed. You have to go through. You have to acknowledge all the ugliness, all the pain, all the things that you've been running away from all these years, the things that you're avoiding and wanting to see. So being well is facing that truth, but holding yourself with grace. I talk about my podcast called the Free Black Girl Podcast, and I chronicle my own healing journey. When I started the Chisholm Group, I also started coaching. I coach Black women on how to quit their jobs and start their own businesses. And when I would start working with my clients, I would tell them, I'm your coach. I'm not a therapist, but you need to get a therapist because this is going to tap dance on all of your stuff. And they would look at me and they'd be like, okay, cool. But I don't know what that means. Like, what does being well mean? What does healing actually mean? And at that point, I have been with my therapist for probably about 4 years, and she's a somatic healer. And so we work on mind and body beyond talking about it, because I'm smart. A lot of y'all are smart. We can intellectualize our pain all day.
Oh, for sure.
But this is about feeling it. Being well is about allowing yourself the space to actually feel it and to feel through it and to understand, what is it doing to my body? What is little me asking for in these moments? When I'm feeling anxious, I'm like, okay, little Najmah, little Najee, what do you need? What's going on? And so it's really getting in touch with who you are. And so that's why I started my podcast, because as I was working with my clients, I'm like, oh, I have to share my journey with people. I have to share how I got free. Being well is being free. Like I have this shirt on, it's one of my merch line, shameless plug, but free joy.
Yeah.
It is like the active space of freeing ourselves in self-liberation. That's what being well is to me, the freedom to feel all the messiness, to be imperfect, because perfection is not a thing. Being well means allowing yourself the grace and compassion to show up fully as yourself and who you are, and to rest when you need to, and to know that you don't have to do anything to deserve that rest. That is really what being well. And in this moment right now that we are facing in this country, being well also means being able to stay grounded, to stay centered amongst all the noise, even when chaos is around you, being able to know why you're doing what you're doing, to know who you are, but then also to know that you're a part of a greater community and that we have each other. So being well means being able to be a part of a beautiful community that we support each other.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Folks, check out the podcast, check out the work she's doing to like free us for those of us who are trying to figure that out. We'll have all of her information in the show notes, all the information on the Exit Interview Podcast website. This was a beautiful conversation. I thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Yes. And definitely reach out, even if it's just to commiserate and join the community for sure.
All right, folks, another episode of the Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators. Make sure to go out and treat yourselves well, folks, and share this podcast with other folks who could definitely benefit. And we'll talk to you later. Peace. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Exit Interview, a podcast for Black educators, I'm sure you'll love similar content in the Alive Podcast Network app. That's right, we've joined a podcast network. Plus, you can support this podcast and enjoy ad-free listening to nearly 100 other Black hosted podcasts. Head on over to Alive Podcast Network today.